All right, so our second card is going to be using texture paste on the background. So we're going to do this one here with the bubbles, and we're also going to put some embossing glazes on top of it. They're colors that match our background colors. So I'm just going to put the dark blue at the bottom, medium in the middle, light at the top. You could, if you want, use whatever texture paste you want and put it on and let it completely dry. Now you'll see with the texture paste how it looks like it's a little bit colored. That's simply by putting it on the background and letting it dry. The ink below, because it's water soluble and because it's a dye ink, it seeps into that texture paste, coloring it all on its own with no effort. So first step is to cut your piece down to the size. So for our card front, we want this to be 4 inches by 5 1/4. I've already got that cut down. And next thing we're going to do is we're going to tape our piece down and then position our stencil and tape it as well. Now, typically you would use a back that would take the tape. This actually doesn't take the tape. I'm just going through the motions. The reason for the tape is so that when you're done, when you're lifting it up, you can lift it up like this, and if you happen to lose your hand on it and it falls, it doesn't wreck your texture paste. So to the side, I have a scrap piece of paper, and I'm going to use that with this once I have my texture paste down. I'm going to be putting the embossing glaze on it while it's wet so that it can dry with the embossing glaze on it. And then we're going to heat up the embossing glaze. Now, you have 2 ways you can do this. You can either melt the embossing glaze while the texture paste is still wet. In that case, the paste will bubble up, which may stay bubbled up once you are done, or it may go back down. For this particular one, I like the look of that with bubbles, so I'm going to do it while it's wet. But just keep in mind that that dimension may not stay in there, and even when you're done embossing, you do need to let the rest of it dry. It will only be the top of the piece that is actually embossed and bubbled. The rest of the texture paste is still going to be wet, so just be careful. So I'm trying not to use too much embossing glaze here because the excess can't be put in each individual container. I do happen to have a container that I use for like mixes, but you don't want to use up a whole bunch of your powders and not be able to put them back. And I tend to have like a mixture of blues just for, say, one day if I'm doing water or something, I can use that. You'll also notice that I'm not completely covering the area, and I'll show you why in a moment. We're going to let that powder bounce around to cover the remaining areas before we take it off. So I'm going to lift this piece up. Make sure you're doing this on a scrap piece of paper. I'm touching an area that doesn't have texture paste, and I'm just going to tap on the back and let that powder bounce around a little bit, and that's going to cover the rest of it. I am going to put the powder right back on because I see there's a spot there that's not covered, as well as right there. So, and if it happens to get covered with a mixture that's not exactly the same, that's totally fine. There we go. So put that powder to the side. We're going to use our heat gun and we're going to melt that powder for this version. right, so that is completely melted, and you'll see some of them are puffed up, some of them have already gone back down. I need to set that aside to dry. Probably about 15 minutes, half an hour is what it's going to take. While we're waiting for that, I am going to take another scrap of paper here, and I've got my seahorse stamp. I am going to stamp it with my embossing ink, and we're going to emboss it with silver. Now, I'm going to take this print here. That was the second print with those sprays. I'm going to use that one. Might as well use some of the texture there. So I'm stamping where I want to see the texture on my stamped image. I'm going to put the powder down. Let's move the ink out of the way. Move the stamp out of the way. And I'm going to emboss that. So that I would hand cut. I don't have a die that matches that particular stamp, so that would get hand cut out to use as an embellishment on the card. Let's move the embossing powder out of the way. And then the last step to prep while we are waiting is we're going to use this particular sentiment on it, and I'm going to do that the same way that I did the one on the last card. I want to have a little mat around it. And I want to trim that out. So once again, I'm trying to put it on there as evenly as possible. And I need my trimmer to trim it. Now for this segment, I just put my stencil to the side. You do want to clean the texture paste off of it as quickly as possible so that it doesn't dry on there. But just be aware, don't leave it aside and then let it accidentally dry all over your stencil. It's going to be a lot harder to get off if you do that. So I'm going to off camera cut this out, let the texture paste dry. I'll be back in a moment for you and we'll put the card together. All right, so our texture paste is completely dried. So we are going to glue it to the card base first. Now, typically I would, just like the first card, I would weigh it down before gluing on the extra elements, but for time, I'm going to do it all at once, and then I'm going to weigh everything down all at once. So you'll see things pop up here, and that's simply because it needs to be held down in order for the glue to stick, because it's a little bit warped. So I'm going to add the seahorse, and then on this part here, because I've got texture paste on this side, I don't need to put my pop-up dot on that side, but I am going to put it on the side that just sticks to the card, because I want to have a little bit of extra dimension. I don't want the sentiment to be partly up and partly down. So by putting some pop dots on the one end that doesn't have texture paste below it, that's going to help even it out a little bit. It may not be the exact dimension, but it's going to be closer than not having anything at all. So there we go. The card is together. I'm going to put my block on that, and I'm going to let that dry while it's weighted down. So our second card is done. I'll see you in the next video for the next card.